Today is day 13 of the Karen Read trial. This is part 2 of my daily recap. We just went through all of the Brian Higgins text messages that Yuri Buchanan had to read on the stand in open court. They end up going to lunch for the lunch break, and then when they come back, Jackson continues his questioning. Jackson wants to know if Buchanan thinks that the texts are flirtatious. Are they romantic? And he says there are in times, but not the whole thing. Jackson wants to know, how would you describe the totality of the convo? And he says, my opinion is that it's an angry girlfriend trying to hurt John, which was very interesting. He agrees that Brian and Karen were back and forth in their conversation, and then he becomes hesitant to answer if he thought Brian was actually interested in Karen romantically. So they start talking about the term ghost because the last 3 text messages sent by Brian Higgins were not responded to by Karen. And Jackson wants to know if Buchanan thinks that Brian Higgins was ghosted. And he said, I understand that term, but I can't categorize if it was a ghosted situation. Did you interpret that as frustration? And he says, no, not at all. I actually didn't remember this, but the last text message between John O'Keefe and Brian Higgins was, are you coming here? And that was from Brian Higgins at 12:20 a.m. on January 29th, when he must have already been at the Albert residence. Jackson wants to know if he has become aware of the phone calls between Brian Higgins and Brian Albert on January 29th around 2:22 a.m. Last trial, Brian Albert testified that they were butt dials, and he said he was not aware of that during the investigation. And Jackson wants to know, well, did you seek to secure Brian Albert's cell phone for the 28th and the 29th? And he says, no, I didn't do an extraction, but if I did, I would have been able to see them. And as you sit here today, you don't know this information about the phone call. And he says that he's never heard that before. A little dagger question from Jackson was, did you become aware that Brian Albert destroyed his phone? And there's an objection in a sidebar. And they come back from a long sidebar. And he says, did you become aware of a phone call from Brian Higgins while at Canton Police Department? And there's an objection, and Jackson wants to know, you didn't investigate any phone calls by Brian Higgins, and apparently he did not. Jackson wants to hammer in on the fact that they never investigated Brian Higgins or Brian Albert's cell phones. There was no reason to ever get his phone. He trusted that the extraction that Brian Higgins provided himself was accurate. I told Higgins, we're not downloading your whole phone, but please make sure what you're giving us is accurate. That's verbatim. Did you have any suspicion of Brian Higgins? Buchanan says, for motives? Honestly, no. The evidence here spoke for itself. And then Jackson wants to know about some more injuries. Did you see a laceration on John's right eye? Yes, a tiny one. You noted he didn't have any broken bones except a skull. And Buchanan goes, well, I didn't perform an x-ray, so I'm not aware. And then Jackson wants the jury to remember that you're also aware that no taillight pieces were found in the lawn until that SUV was in Mass State Police custody, and he does agree with that. We start seeing some surveillance footage from the waterfall. Right here is Brian Higgins. I want to say that is Karen, but I don't think they identified her in this screenshot, but they were looking for Brian Higgins and Brian Albert. And Jackson wants to know, what are these two men doing? Can you describe what they're doing? And he says they're possibly squaring off in a stance. Jackson wants to know, what does squaring off mean? He explained it. And then he says, Albert and Higgins are play fighting. So Jackson asks, what are they doing? They're possibly wrestling or grappling. They also identified John O'Keefe. He's over here in the two-tone gray sweatshirt. I'll show you a video at the very end of this that my friend sent me from Twitter that was really interesting. But I think the jury gets the whole video, but they didn't show this in court. So just wait until the end for that. This is the part where you can see them kind of play fighting a little bit. And it was like, oh, what are you guys doing? And then here's a little bit of a zoomed in angle. That is John O'Keefe right there. We watched the surveillance. It's a ring camera footage from John O'Keefe's house when Karen Read was backing her Lexus out of the driveway and she makes contact with John's car. And Jackson wants Buchanan to acknowledge that she did make contact, and he says in what areas, and he said it was specifically the right rear of the Lexus. And then we get into some questions about Chloe. I just love this screen pause of him, but we'll leave that up for a little bit. So then we start talking about the dog. We learned that they no longer care for the dog, and he says they don't have it anymore, and that's correct. What would you call it? And he goes, giving it up for adoption. They keep referencing the dog as it too, which is really interesting. How do you know that? What would you call it? And rehomed. So finally, we learn that Buchanan traveled to the dog's new home, met the dog's new owner, who is apparently a vet, I believe, and he received vet records from the new owner. The dog has been renamed, and all of the records that were sent over to the defense don't have anywhere the dog's new name, which is Cora, or the family's owner's last name. And they have no other paperwork that supports that the dog was rehomed. Some more things, just hammering in how poorly this investigation was done. We start talking about report writing. He says in a perfect world, they would write the report right after or as it is happening. And Jackson throws out a few facts. Are you aware that more than 20 of the official reports for this event were not written for more than 100 days? 11 reports are more than 300 days. They were written more than 300 days later. And then there are 3 reports that have been written more than 400 days past the event in question. And he starts asking about Ricky D'Antano, who was driving the vehicle that Ryan Nagel was in, that saw Karen Reed and her vehicle at the house at 34 Fairview that night. And he learned that they were outside and they were witnesses. They arrived simultaneously to Karen and John. And then it's revealed that you instructed Michael Proctor to interview them in August of 2023. So we know that Ryan Nagel was actually interviewed February of 2022, right after the incident occurred, which is normal. But the person that was driving the vehicle and the person that was in the back seat were not interviewed until September 2023, which is wild. That's a year and a half later, and they were witnesses. They should have been, like Ricky, I think it came out that he only had 1 or 2 drinks. He was practically sober, driving his truck. Why wasn't he interviewed for so long? And Jackson says, wouldn't it have been important to interview the 2 of them? He says, it is important to interview every witness, but the other person in the car had already been interviewed, so they didn't interview him, basically. Oh man, that's a lot. So let me find the video and I'll share that with you guys here. So here is John O'Keefe right here. He's signaling something to Brian Higgins. You tell me what it says. And he signs his check. They did play this in court.